Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Sri Narasimhan. I'm the Deputy Editor at Axelle, and welcome you on behalf of my colleagues, Dr. Matthew Gilbert, who is the North American Outreach Editor at the Lancet, and Dr. Amy Slogrove, who is a Senior Editor at the Lancet Child and Adolescent Health. Today's event is momentous as it marks our inaugural event as part of our 50th anniversary celebrations at Cell Press. Throughout this year and beyond, Cell Press will focus on the real-world impact of the science that we publish and launch initiatives to inspire new directions in research. And as all of you are joining us today for this important discussion, we hope you'll continue to be a part of our efforts in promoting better outcomes, driving innovation, bringing communities together, and most importantly, in advocating for science and scientists. We are excited to have yet another exciting collaboration with our colleagues and friends at the Lancet. Our journals and people share the collective passion for science, science that inspires, science for better lives, and its ability to solve the world's greatest problems. This is our first external audience-facing Inclusive Language Series panel. The Cell Press Inclusive Language Series was initiated by our former I&D officer, Dr. Isabel Goldman, and has since then been championed and supported by several colleagues, with today's having the support of the Lancet's Inclusion and Diversity Officer and founding editor of the Lancet Global Health, Dr. Zoe Mullen. In Isabel's words, the Inclusive Language Series has the goal of providing our editors, employees, and now our broader scientific audience with the perspectives needed to make language of scientific publishing more inclusive, accurate, and precise, while also protecting against the harm from the use of stigmatizing, inaccurate, and exclusionary language. We've had 4 prior internal events with incredible panelists across a range of topics, and these are available for you to watch, and we encourage you to explore these at your convenience. So these topics include sex and gender, visual communication, health and disability, and also race, ethnicity, and ancestry. So today our focus is on neurodiversity, and our session will cover perspectives and discussions into making spaces safe for neurodivergent individuals, discuss intersectionality and neurodivergence, and also unpack the importance of evolving scientific language to reflect lived experiences while ensuring rigorous scientific investigation. We recognize today's topic may be very close for some of you, and for many others, an opportunity to listen and learn, and we thank you in advance for being a part of it. Without further ado, I will pass this along now to my colleague, Dr. Matt Gilbert, who will introduce our distinguished panelists. Thank you again and welcome.
Thank you, Sri, for that lovely introduction. I'm Matthew Gilbert, the North American Outreach Editor for the Lancet. Thank you to all of our audience members, panelists, and my fellow hosts for joining today. We're all very excited to hear more about this important topic. I'll be introducing each of our speakers before they present, and we will have time for questions and answers at the end, which you are welcome to enter into the Q&A box in the Zoom function, and they will be addressed by our moderators after the presentations. So our first speaker is Dr. Mary Doherty. Mary is a consultant anesthetist, clinical associate professor at the School of Medicine, University College Dublin, honorary associate professor at the University of Exeter, and honorary clinical research fellow at Brighton and Sussex Medical School. Diagnosed as autistic over a decade ago, she is parent to 2 neurodivergent young people. Mary is founder of Autistic Doctors International, an organization dedicated to peer support, advocacy, research, and training. Her research interests focus on autism and healthcare, including both autistic people accessing services as well as autistic healthcare providers, and she has developed the Autistic Space, SPACE, framework to address these needs. Mary, if you'd like to please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Let me see if I can share my screen. So you should be seeing my title slide there. Do let me know if not. But what I really wanted to talk to you today about was why the language that we choose really matters to autistic people in particular. I'll give a very brief overview to neurodiversity, focusing mostly on the terminology to use, but I really want us to think about the wider picture and the implications of incorrectly framing autism, particularly in terms of research validity. And this is where my journey started. My journey into the world of autism started with these two munchkins. My first child was recognized as autistic over a decade ago. And that's when I recognized, well, if he was autistic, then I most definitely was too. And the thing is, he has benefited from growing up under that neurodiversity paradigm. He's now a confidently autistic teenager. And that's very much in contrast to my older child, my first child, whose challenges were framed very much in that traditional deficit perspective, that deficit framing. And that had consequent negative effects on mental health. And I think overall, what I've learned in all of the time that I've been involved in this world and the work that I've been doing both in advocacy and research is that the way in which we frame autism has a profound effect on outcome. And I firmly believe that a neurodiversity affirmative approach is the key to an optimum outcome. And the thing is, the words that we use have powerful impact much more widely. And for example, think about why there are media guidelines around responsible reporting of suicides, for example. The way suicides are reported directly impacts contagion or copycat suicides in the community. And so our choice of words can save lives. And we know that suicide and poor mental health disproportionately affects our autistic community. And I believe that we can improve autistic well-being and potentially save autistic lives by the words that we choose to use. And that's really how important language is. And thinking about, late diagnosed autistic adults or indeed families of children new to the world of autism, they learn what it means to be autistic from us, as clinical professionals. And that clinical work, of course, is underpinned by scientific research, which is why the way that we write about autism in our scholarly work matters just so much. And this is my favorite description of autism. It comes from Liz Pellicano and her team. And it references the diagnostic criteria, but reframes it in a respectful and yet accurate way. Autism is a lifelong neurodevelopmental difference that influences the way that influences the way a person interacts and communicates with others and experiences the world around them. And just think about that message and what it means for us to receive that message. And in particular, in contrast to the more usual message that so many of us have received from our earliest days, that message that we're somehow broken, defective, disordered, in need of fixing. Is any wonder that autistic people reach adulthood with our self-esteem in tatters and our mental health so poor? Together, we can really change this, I think, for the next generation of autistic children. Because we can send families down one of two paths, into the world of deficit, disorder, and cure-seeking, or we can show them the path of difference, disability, and neurodiversity. And the thing, I'm not quite sure why my cursor has suddenly stopped moving. Oh, there we go. Yeah. What I'm noticing is a shift from that traditional core deficit framing of autism to a neurodiversity affirmative approach. And I'm seeing that shift in healthcare, particularly in psychiatry and in pediatrics. I'm also seeing it in education and even in biomedical autism research. And the thing that I'm noticing is that it's a one-way journey. People who understand the neurodiversity paradigm, who really get it, they don't go back. Clinicians see the benefit for autistic people and for the families that they work with, and they just don't go back to that traditional core deficit framing. Now, those who sometimes resist making that switch, often it's because they've misunderstood some core aspects, some key aspects of the neurodiversity paradigm. So let's briefly look at what we mean by neurodiversity. And while we don't have time to go into it in detail, the important thing to recognize is that it's a feature of populations. Neurodiversity is a feature of populations, not individuals, and it relates to the diversity in human neurocognitive functioning. Our brains are all different. The neurodiversity paradigm is a way of conceptualizing neurodiversity, which in itself is just a biological fact. And it means thinking in terms of differences, not deficits. It means, thinking and considering the social model of disability, which we'll hear more about in a while. Key questions are around terminology, neurodiverse, neurodivergent, but particularly the use of identity first or person first language, autistic person or person with autism, which I'll talk about in a moment. And I won't get into the paradigm in detail, except to say that probably the most common misconception is that neurodiversity advocates reject the concept of autism as disability and embrace that sort of superpower narrative. And that's just absolutely not the case. Reject disorder, yeah. Well, absolutely embrace disability, considering co-occurring medical conditions, which absolutely need solutions, and a need for a person-centered support and recognition of external contributions to disability. Let's look in more detail at terminology, because there really is a lot of confusion around it, and it's important to recognize and acknowledge that confusion, but also to say that it's okay to get it wrong. It's more important, in my view, to embrace the neurodiversity paradigm than it is to be inhibited by the fear of being criticized for mistakes around terminology. But again, equally, as scientists, it's important for us to be as accurate as we can. So let's consider the phrase neurodiverse people and think about what that means to you. And in particular, what proportion of the population is neurodiverse? Because that's a useful way of it's a useful marker of your own understanding of the paradigm. So pick a number. Sometimes people might think, 1 to 2%. But no, that's the proportion of autistic people. No, I think that's probably an underestimation, but at least that's the recognized prevalence rate at this point in time. Is it 15 to 20%? Again, no, that's neurodivergent people. Is it 100%? Is everybody neurodiverse? Now that's very different to saying, is everybody a little bit autistic? But we might come back to that in a bit. But yes, absolutely. 100% of the population is neurodiverse for sure, because society is neurodiverse. It's made up of individuals, made up of people with lots of different neurotypes. So individuals are neurotypical or neurodivergent, and those who are neurodivergent more than one way, like myself, for example, often identify as multiply neurodivergent. So really important to recognize that neurodiversity is absolutely not a synonym for autism. It's not a synonym for disability. It's not a euphemism for disability, which is unfortunately how it sometimes is used. And yeah, the entire population taken together, we are all neurodiverse. Some constructions that you might see that are, maybe less accurate. As I said, neurodiverse people is completely accurate if you are referring to a neurodiverse group. But if you're only referring to neurodivergent people, to people who fall under that, that neurodiversity umbrella in terms of various diagnostic categories, then neurodiverse people is not accurate. The correct term would be neurodivergent people. Neurodiverse as applied to a single individual doesn't make a lot of sense. People with neurodiversity, no, absolutely not. I'm hearing a lot about, people with neurodiverse conditions, and that doesn't really make sense. People with neurodivergent conditions for sure, or with neurodivergence. But the one that I'm hearing, unfortunately, increasing frequency is people diagnosed with neurodiversity. And honestly, that one, that makes my toes curl, because it really, neurodiversity is not a diagnosis. It is not a synonym for any condition. The use of I am neurodiverse, that's a bit more tricky, because it's really important to recognize an individual person's right to use whatever language they feel most appropriate to themselves. And the thing about there are, a lot of people simply don't like the term neurodivergent, and will prefer to use neurodiverse even when they know the issues around the construction and how inaccurate it is. And I think we have to recognize that. But I think for sure, recognizing the difference between neurodiversity and neurodivergence is really important. But even more important, I think, is looking at terminology in terms of identity first language or person first language. And that's the difference between autistic person or person with autism. And traditionally in healthcare, we're taught to use person first language, not to refer to people as their conditions. But this really doesn't apply for the autistic population, because autistic person, identity first language, that is the preferred terminology for most autistic people. Now, there's discrepancies and there isn't a consensus in terms of preferred language, but there is a consensus. Recent research has shown that there is a consensus around what is the least offensive. So certainly identity first language is the least offensive to all groups. And it's important because it reduces stigma. It certainly promotes a positive self-image, because the alternative, person first language, it's person with autism. There is that sort of implicit suggestion of the potential of a person without autism. And, that's not really a valid construct for us. Autism, being autistic, it is who we are. So the use of person first language absolutely perpetuates stigma. It does promote that cure-seeking mentality. The other thing that's interesting with the use of person first language, no matter what the qualifier is, it's always something that's negative or undesirable. Now, we have to recognize that person first language is often the preferred construction, the preferred language by parents and professionals. But I think that is changing, and I'm really glad to see the acceleration in the use of identity first language, because person first language is really offensive to a lot of autistic people. So I have no hesitation in asking you all to please switch to using identity first language when referring to us collectively. Obviously, if you're working with somebody who prefers person first language, then absolutely respect that. But collectively, identity first language is absolutely preferable. And just looking at the potential impact and the potential associations between how we frame autism and potential outcomes, just want to consider one finding from a piece of research that we did into the experiences of autistic doctors. We looked at how our participants, who were all medical doctors who identify as autistic, how we framed autism. So the majority framed autism as a difference. Over half also as a disability. And a small but significant minority, 13%, viewed autism as a disorder. And then we looked at the mental health outcomes, particularly around suicidality, which was, appallingly high, much, much higher than other physician groups. But what was interesting was that considering autism to be a disorder was associated with a preference for the term doctors with autism, for person first language. And really importantly, I think, it was also associated, so considering autism to be a disorder was also associated with having attempted suicide. Now, cross-sectional study, we certainly can't imply, we can't apply causality. But at the same time, I think if we were to repeat this work with the wider autistic community, I think we would find that same association. And in my view, the way I choose to view this is that it validates my impression that disorder framing is negative in terms of mental health for autistic people, and that neurodiversity affirmative approach is potentially preventive in terms of mental health. One other quick piece of work that I want to share with you, it was from my work with autistic psychiatrists, and it's just one quote that I want to share from Lisa, who is an autistic psychiatrist. She's a child and adolescent psychiatrist working in neurodevelopmental services. She was herself diagnosed aged 5, and talking about reading research on autism, what she said was, you read papers about horrible autistic people having no empathy and no theory of mind. Is that really me? If it's not me, does that mean that I'm not actually autistic? Or this paper is actually very wrong? Which one is it? There's a lot of cognitive dissonance going on. And I think if the way that we talk about and write about autism doesn't resonate with autistic people who are also clinicians in the field of autism, if that research that we do is based on narrow stereotypes, then what does that say about the validity of our findings? I wonder how many unrecognized autistic people are being included in so-called control groups, for example. And the one final point is the issue of the positionality of clinicians and researchers. Because as one of my other participants notes, and this is an autistic psychiatrist, if we don't recognize ourselves as autistic, then how can we recognize patients accurately? So here's another question I'll leave you to ponder. How confident are you about which category you might fit into, whether neurotypical or neurodivergent? Because so many clinicians and researchers in the field of autism are coming to the realization that they are also autistic or otherwise neurodivergent. And that's often after they've had a child diagnosed, as was my own journey. So I'll leave you that question to ponder. And there's just my contact details. Do feel free to get in touch, and I'll finish it there.
Thank you very much, Mary. Very interesting. And again, I'd like to remind everyone that we will be addressing questions at the end, but feel free to enter them into the Q&A box as they come up. Our next speaker is Hari Srinivasan. Hari is a PhD neuroscience student researching the sensory domain in autism at Vanderbilt University, an alumnus of UC Berkeley, where he ran a class on autism, a Paul and Daisy Soros Fellow, a Distinguished Fellow at the First Center for Autism and Innovation, a non-federal member of the NIH's Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, and on the boards or advisory boards of the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, the Autism Society of America, the International Society for Autism Research, Duke University's Autism Center of Excellence, and the Brain Foundation. Hari also writes extensively on disability and autism issues with multiple high-impact essays in high-profile media such as Time, Newsweek, Fortune, the Boston Globe, and Psychology Today. Welcome, Hari.
I'm with Srinivasan. I have autism and ADHD. Autism has many variables. I'm going to use my task to speak voicemail. Otherwise, we may be here all day. Yes, I need to do my TI for voice. LOL.
My disability includes sensory motor challenges, body schema, social anxiety, mood regulation, OCD, a highly impulsive body, and some co-occurring health issues. So there is a lot of stuff going on in one single body. These do present significant obstacles to my everyday functioning. From special education to higher education has been a long road. So I'm absolutely enjoying the opportunity of education, even as I try to navigate my autism, which can feel like rowing a leaky boat. I graduated UC Berkeley with a heap of unexpected honors and awards. Like giant pats of encouragement that I must be on the right track. Other opportunities to learn and grow included writing for the Daily Californian, Spectrum at Cal, the UC Berkeley Disability Lab, teaching an autism class. More pats of encouragement in getting a mention on President Obama's Instagram. What an honor. And what a thoughtful message from my personal hero, disability rights legend, the late Judy Heumann. I also got to research autism under the guidance of Professor Dacre Keltner. I'm now a PhD neuroscience student at Vanderbilt. A budding neuroscientist has got to have brain neurons on the slide background. LOL. I'm a PD Soros Fellow and a NIES Fellow. And just recently I was awarded the prestigious National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship. I'm in the labs of Professor Carissa Cascio and Professor Mark Wallace. Both research the sensory system in autism. I hope some of you will get to participate in my research. I continue to write more articles. And am involved in numerous disability orgs. In today's talk, I'm going to cover two topics. One is around inclusive language and the other is my perspective of the models of disability. So let's dive right in. Those who favor its continued use, contend that it's deemed necessary for scientific inquiry, arguing that alternatives might elude the pursuit of effective science. Let's see the problems with this. The 1963 Life magazine article introducing an extraordinary new treatment, yay, by Dr. Iver Louvaz, exemplified this issue. Autistics are referred to as mental cripples. Pamela, the 6-year-old autistic child, is made to stand barefoot on a floor that is laced with metal, so that shocks could be administered by the clinician, who is wearing shoes. The autistic children were screamed at, slapped by the therapists, and made to feel scared. By using the pathologizing language of mental cripples, the use of dehumanizing shocks, screams, slaps, and punishment was justified and even hailed as an extraordinary treatment. We can almost draw another parallel to unsightly ordinances or ugly laws, which were a series of laws that were enforced in the United States and other European countries in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Because they were unsightly and ugly, disabled people were fined or imprisoned for appearing in public during the daytime. The ugly laws were justified under the guise of public health and safety, and claims of the disabled as a threat to public morality. These laws were used as a form of social control and discrimination against the disabled, who were seen as undesirable and unworthy of inclusion in public life. In the legal arena, earlier examples of pathologizing language included terms like feeble-minded and imbecile, used to justify eugenics. Like in the landmark Buck v. Bell, 1927 case. The point being that pathologizing language by the scientific community cements societal acceptability of that language, which then can be used as a justification for great harm to this population. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 mandated the removal of such discriminatory language from federal laws and policies related to disabled individuals. If laws can do it, why not science? Isn't science a contributor towards the progress of humanity? There is no reason why science and humanity cannot march together. Our use of scientific language can and should evolve to be inclusive of humanity even as there is a rush for solutions. I think one source of confusion is between the terminology used to refer to specific biology components around medical health issues. Autistics may have a terminology used in referring to autism the person or autism the group in society. For example, these are some proteins thought to be involved in seizures and GI issues. I won't go into the science details, but identification means that we can target these for intervention. For example, development of biologics that target inflammatory cytokines could not just be neuroprotective, but could bring enormous relief to GI symptoms associated with an immune response. On the other hand is the terminology when referring to autism the person, or autism the group, and language really matter here. Because the autistic is living in the community for many decades, and constantly hearing language of defect or lacking, not just exerts a heavy mental health toll on the autistic, but also impacts how society around us, who hears this same language, treats us. What is needed here is a dash of empathy. A reminder that we are, after all, writing about and referring to fellow human beings. Encouraging an empathic mindset shift in science writing may be a good start to bring about change. I also want to remind researchers. New terminology every few years is not the scientific breakthrough we hope for and need. We spent so much time discussing another new label of profound when we already had level 3. We need to move the needle, more actual solutions and progress. To my peers, I want to say this. Dear disabled peers, let's take the lead from the wheelchair user community. The derogatory term, cripple, was repurposed to the positive, crip. Now you have Crip Hop and an Oscar-nominated documentary on disability rights, Crip Camp. We can reclaim existing vocabulary about us, and depathologize them. The wheelchair user community has embraced both person-first and identity-first language. Person-first language was the language of the early disability rights movement. Later we also adopted identity-first language. Turns out, both have good intentions. So let's not keep arguing about which one is bad. Let's move on, accept both usages, and focus on solutions and progress. Next up is my perspective on the models of disability. The social model of disability emphasizes societal barriers as the main obstacle for the disabled people. Major goals were deinstitutionalization and moving us towards inclusion. This model has deeply influenced disability legislation and policy. I will quickly mention the neurodiversity model here, in the context of the social model. Autism is one of the many disabilities under this umbrella. The concept posits that all disabilities commonly perceived as neurological or psychiatric in nature are simply neurodifferences or variations of human cognitive functioning. Similarities between social and ND is that both look at changing societal diversity. Differences lie in their origin. The social model from a disability rights perspective. ND is from a neurological differences perspective. Both models have a ton of gatekeepers, people the autistic is surrounded by. the therapists, the social workers, the autism professional, and the educators. All well-meaning, of course. The medical model of disability viewed disability as an individual medical condition that needed medical intervention. However, as it was the dominant historic paradigm with its focus on just the medical aspect, it resulted in horrible mass institutionalization. The gatekeeper here was the medical professional who had to certify fit enough to rejoin society. The negative history meant distrust of the model by social model advocates. Problem is that this got conflated to a distrust of all things medical, which also translated to no research should be allowed on the medical front. But the reality is that medical issues are ubiquitous in autism. To put a human face on this, I know a peer who can have unto 20 seizures a day and a family that had to hire an RV to take their son to the doctor so that he would have an access to the bathroom the entire time. Many of these will get compounded over time, and we will be terribly unhealthy senior citizens, adding to the existing issues of aging. For many of us on the spectrum, there is an urgent need for medical research that will lead to medical solutions. Enough of diagnostic overshadowing. Precision pharma, not psychotropic drug cocktails. We need that research into biomarkers and underlying physiology that can get us to solutions, along with robust healthcare policies. This is a big gap in the NT and social models. Saying disability is a mere variation of the human condition can be a slippery slope because it implies that nothing more needs be done about it. And we come a full circle. All this ties into the idea of equity of access that the late disability rights activist, Judy Heumann, discussed in her memoir. I quote, "Equity of access looks different for me. When this is not understood, we come across as complaining even though we are asking for the same rights as everyone else." The point is that, just like Judy said, equity of access looks different for different autistics. For some autistics, a focus on just social aspects of strengths-based opportunities are what is needed to get to equity of access. For other autistics, equity of access means they also need solutions to their challenges, including the medical ones, as well as the strengths-based opportunities. It's a dual-pronged and not either-or. The flashlight focus on a strengths-based approach of the neurodiversity movement is wonderful and needed, and will help open many doors of opportunities. But the flashlight also needs to turn its beam towards challenges-based solutions, otherwise a huge chunk of the autistic population is left behind. The same door of opportunity is shut to the autistics with challenges on the communication front and health fronts, the ones classified as level 2 and level 3 on the diagnosis. To put a human face on this, how does inclusion work for autistics who are shut out and homebound due to behavioral, communication or health issues? For example, what parent or social group will allow their NT children to play with an autistic child who may be aggressive? So many of my adult peers are stuck at home with aging parents because no program wants them or they have health issues. Even caregivers want the easy clients. I also want to add this important insight. Solutions for the most marginalized members of a group benefit the entire group. A simple example is those street ramp, curb cuts, and elevators to help wheelchair users is being used by every parent with a stroller or every traveler with luggage. By extension, if we can find solutions to help the autistics most impacted by disability, the ones referred to as level 3 on the DSM criteria, these solutions may well end up benefiting a whole bunch of other autistics. We must both talk and walk inclusion. It's not enough for us to just push for better language in scientific publications and then feel that is a great job done. What is the content of those publications? What are the research priorities? Are they looking to address the challenges and getting us to those challenges-based solutions? And are they looking to leverage strengths so that we get to open those doors of opportunity? What is the end goalpost of inclusion? Watch this next clip to find out.
I want to talk to you about inclusion and belonging for people with disabilities. Acceptance and inclusion of disabled people into all walks of society is no doubt an important first step, but what we need goes beyond inclusion. Inclusion means just existing in the same space as non-disabled people. Disabled people need to not just be included, we need to feel we belong. Belonging is a sense of community, where you are accepted as an equal member of the group and where your life is seen as having worth. Belongingness in society is, I think, what we all yearn for at the end of the day, whether we are disabled or not. Starting today, let us all strive together towards belongingness for people with disabilities.
We have much work left to do. We have miles to go before we sleep. But we are running out of time. So I will just end with this last bit. I like to think of myself as possibility, hurry as possibility. I want you to think of disability as possibility too. Only when you think possibility can the door of opportunity open. From possibility to opportunity. Can the quest for solutions ever end? Never, answers the mind. Emotions and the sensory body are sinkholes en route. Mind urges. Take detours, challenge the sinkholes, we must persevere. Have to travel possibilities, open opportunities, and pave new roads.
Thank you very much, Ari. Our final speaker today will be Axelle Ahanhanzo. Axelle is an equity, diversity, and inclusion changemaker and social impact entrepreneur. In the spring of 2023, she founded LAUDACE, LAUDACE, all capital, to prioritize equity and intersectionality in ED&I transformation. With subject matter expertise in anti-racism, neuro-inclusivity, and gender equity, Axelle's diverse career spans sales, recruitment, communication, and ED&I. Having lived in 8 countries and speaking 6 languages, she holds an MSc in corporate communications and a BA in modern languages. Drawing from lived experiences with workplace burnout, exclusion, and trauma, Axelle advocates for marginalized groups through holistic lenses. Recognized as a top 10 finalist at TEDx Amsterdam Women's Talent Night 2023, she called for action to urgently create a neuro-inclusive world for girls and women from all backgrounds. With her unwavering commitment to social justice and her atypical background, Axelle leads the way toward a more inclusive and equitable future. Welcome, Axelle.
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for being here today. So I'll be walking you through the importance of looking at neurodiversity and the experiences of neurodivergent people from a multifaceted lens, or so-called intersectional lens. My name is Axelle Ahanhanzo, and I am an equity, diversity, and inclusion changemaker and social impact entrepreneur at LAUDACE. I founded LAUDACE in the culminating 8 years of experiencing everything from sexual assault, ableism, racism, bullying, workplace burnout, and trauma. And so I've channeled that into my work to share my story and empower others to do the same with courage that knows no bounds. So as I move forward in the session, or like the next 15 minutes now, I'll be speaking about my personal experiences. And I want you to remember that when you have met one neurodivergent person, you've met one neurodivergent person. The next thing I want to also say is that we often speak of conditions such as ADHD, autism, and whatnot, and it's very important that we do not forget to include conditions that are less sensationalized, like bipolar, schizophrenia, OCD, and way more, that also fall under the neurodivergent umbrella. So when I think of neurodiversity, the first word that comes to mind is neurotype. So that is whether you're neurodivergent or neurotypical, as Mary explained to us earlier. And when I think of neurotype, my brain associates this word with the word identity. And when I think of identity, I want to ask you, who are you, right? And if I was to turn that question to myself, I would tell you that, well, you can visibly see that I am a Black woman. You might have guessed that I'm neurodivergent based on the intro that Matthew just gave, but there's so much more beyond the surface to make sense of my experiences as a person, right? If you were to look a little further than what you can see or guess, you'd find out that I'm also highly educated, I'm cisgender, heterosexual, I'm middle class, I'm an educator, I'm a polyglot, and all these other experiences or facets of my identity that make me Axelle, and that essentially shape how I will move in society, how I will gain access to things in society, and how I will feel a sense of belonging in society. Of course, these different identities will intersect, they will influence one another, and they will also compound some of the experiences that I experience over time. And I find this very important because in my journey towards realizing I am neurodivergent, when I was late diagnosed, I realized that my gender and my race and also my age were key identity factors or dimensions that explained why I was late diagnosed or diagnosed later in life. You could even think of things like social class, which can also impact people's ability to access healthcare or resources that would enable them to get to the answers they need quicker in life or earlier in life. So this session is really an invitation for you to look at yourself and neurodivergent people as mosaics. We're all unique mosaics of identity, right? And so this is extremely important as we move forward. And this concept of mosaic that I have, that I kind of parallel with Kimberly Crenshaw's defined term in 1989, which he called intersectionality, is I think they're quite synonymous, and I use this to image what intersectionality means, right? And so I want to tell you a bit more about intersectionality. Intersectionality is essentially a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves and create obstacles that are often not understood amongst conventional ways of thinking, right? So intersectionality doesn't mean that because you're in a minority, you get special standards or special treatments in the eyes of some. The original term was meant to describe how dimensions of society or identity, such as race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics all intersect with one another and overlap. So when you think of neurodivergence, or you think of disability or age, gender, disability, social class, do not think of them as exclusive sections of inclusion and diversity, or inclusive characteristics of someone's being. On the contrary, we should think about these as issues that come into communion, and that to even add further to that, they intersect and they amplify themselves as they intersect as well, right? And this really calls on the importance of looking at social and systemic issues through this intersectional lens to understand the particular experiences of neurodivergent individuals. Audre Lorde once said that there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives, right? And when I think of my experience and how I had struggles with accessing healthcare when I burned out, and I had to figure out myself that I had ADHD. I was the person who found out from after I was recovering with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or being treated for complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And after my eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy, I realized that some of the restlessness that I felt was not going away. And so I brought that up to my first therapist, who essentially believed me, and we went through the process of going through the ADHD diagnosis. But I didn't have the same experience when that therapist left the practice where I was still at 6 months later, and when I had already started medication for ADHD. And one of the things that happened that neurodivergent people, or specifically ADHD, bring up is that as they start medicating themselves with ADHD or taking care of the ADHD, symptoms of autism become a bit louder. And that's exactly what happened to me. So I thought, well, I'm at that practice. Hopefully they'll listen to me this time around again. And when I brought the issue of my symptoms or my traits of autism, I was not believed. And I was told, oh, you must have BPD, you don't have autism. And there was no further inquiry that was done to figure out and do the extensive diagnosis process that I went through about a year later. And it's funny because when I went to those two practitioners, I essentially prepared, because I was reading other women's experience with autism diagnosis, and I saw how many people were excluded from gaining access to their diagnosis, or a chance at getting diagnosed. I prepared a 16-page slide for the practitioners to review traits or symptoms that I had listed since I'm a kid, from stimming behavior, repetitive behavior, to social communication challenges, different things that I did that made me identify with autism at nearly 30 years old. And in the process of getting my diagnosis as well, I felt so isolated because the world around me doesn't understand what autism really is. They didn't really understand what ADHD really is. So when I brought that up, I lost friends, I lost opportunities, and it has been a very difficult process of grief and finding ground, finding belonging in my surroundings, with my family, with my friends. And luckily, I have been able to advocate for myself, but it was not an easy road. And I know this is a shared experience with late diagnosed persons who get their life completely redefined as a result of their late diagnosis. It is so important that we look at people's intersectional experiences with neurodivergence, because there's already so many barriers to accessing diagnosis for adults. But then if you look at women, if you look at women of color, if you look at young women of color, it gets more and more challenging. And this has serious consequences, right? Mary was speaking about the suicide rates. I identify with those suicide rates. My first attempt with suicide was when I was 9 years old, and I have had multiple ideations or attempts since then. Luckily, my diagnosis and being given the keys to my own brain kind of saved me and made me realize that there was nothing wrong with me, and that everything that society was complaining about who I was or who I am was intrinsically linked to my neurodivergence. And so many people like me are being, misunderstood. I think one of the things that come up with when I think of autism, for instance, and women, we tend to be very blunt and we tend to be very direct. I speak literally. So usually when I understand or when I say something, I literally say what I say, right? I don't mean something else. But the way neurotypical or let's say allistic communication is shaped is that oftentimes my way of communicating is not the standard, and by default I'm constantly misunderstood, and this has been my experience since I was a kid. And when we think about gender and cultural biases, if we were to dive deeper into that, I think the diagnosis ratio for women and versus men so men versus women for autism is 4-to-1. We're less likely to get diagnosed because research has mostly focused on the experiences of white autistic boys and white autistic ADHDers, for instance, in the case of ADHD. So of course, it's not going to be recognized in a woman whose traits, let's say, manifest differently because of societal conditioning of gender and gender expectations as well. Society is a lot less forgiving to women who are hyperactive, for instance. And that was also my experience. And like I said as well, the therapist who I went to for my autism diagnosis didn't have the same level of knowledge and the same level of, let's say, updated practice that the therapist that eventually diagnosed me with autism has. So of course, this is extremely dangerous because women with autism are going to practitioners, GPs, going to other therapists and whatnot, and they're being told, you're too pretty to be neurodivergent, to be autistic. You're too pretty to be autistic. You have too many friends. You're too sociable. You finish school. You can't be autistic. How can we say that to people? Is what I think of when I think of this. And if I was to zoom a bit more into my experiences and Blackness, and particularly my Black womanhood, I often think of this research from Georgetown University Law, where they speak about the adultification of women or girls who are Black from the age of 5 to 15. So they did this research and they found that adults view Black girls as less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers. This is something that resonates a lot to me because throughout my childhood, I was misunderstood in school. I was punished a lot. Even when I got bullied by peers, I ended up being punished too. So when I read that these white girls of the same age, so compared to these white girls of the same age, Black girls need less nurturing, they need less protection, they need less to be supported less, they need to be comforted less, they know more about adult topics, they know more about sex, and they're seen as more independent. This is how I felt adults treated me in growing up. I remember also throughout my let's say self-diagnosis that led to a proper diagnosis process, that I would read people online were sharing how they were going to their parents' house or to opening their school reports to look at the signs that the autism or the ADHD had always been there. And I did the same, and I thought, oh, let me go to my parents' house and retrieve all my reports because they're still there. And when I went there, from I think 1997 till the end of high school, so that was 2011 for me, there were like trimester after trimester, like signs of autism and ADHD in my school reports, but I was not deemed the same, let's say, care and support that someone with a disability with ADHD and autism should deserve or should require in a school, because my teachers back then would have never seen me, a Black girl, as someone deserving of that care, that grace, and that empathy. And this is something that extends further in society when you look at the disproportionate rates of maternity, let's say, mortality for Black women, which is, I think, about 4 to 5 times more likely to die of during pregnancy or when they're giving birth compared to their peers. This is absolutely shocking. And when I think of, for instance, this nursing book from 2014, where it says things like, Blacks often report pain intensity more than other cultures. They believe suffering and pain are inevitable. Another shocking statement of that nursing book says, Jews may be vocal and demanding of assistance. They believe that pain must be shared and validated by others. Can you imagine that when we're sharing these very grave stereotypes about communities that deserve healthcare, that deserve to be taken care of, that deserve the support to stay alive, to have a chance at life, we're essentially exacerbating division, exacerbating exclusion, and essentially causing death. And if I was to push that out of the healthcare space and look at recent experiences, this is a graph from my Oura ring. So I wear this ring that logs my sleep, my menstrual cycle, my temperature, and a bunch of other data. And what you see there is a spike that happened after I had a call with a public servant. The reason I had a call with that public servant was because I had missed a deadline. And with ADHD, what happens is that I'm not very good with timekeeping. In fact, I'm time agnostic, so that, or time blind. For me, time is now or not now. And I don't really operate in the same way as others when it comes to that. So things like executive dysfunction, under which, let's say, time agnosia falls, also involve things as, managing tasks effectively, being able to complete tasks, being able to meet deadlines, things like that. So when I missed that deadline, I sought help, and I was connected with my advisor at that public service place, and I essentially told her, hey, like, I'm autistic and ADHD. I didn't do this on purpose. I generally missed the deadline. It was not my fault. There were some things that were not clear for me, et cetera, et cetera. And her first reaction was to tell me that she was not my doctor, that I had to go seek help somewhere else, and that ultimately I seem lucid enough to explain my challenges. Lucid enough to explain my challenges for me means that you don't seem autistic enough to me. You don't seem ADHD enough to me. And when I told her, hey, this is quite ableist to say, she told me, she actually hung up on the phone. 30 minutes later, she calls me back and she tells me that, oh, yeah, she's really trying to help me, but that I called her racist. I told her I never used the word racist. I used the word ableist. But that was very depictive of the image that women had of me and the impact that my race had in invisibilizing my disability. A week later, I went to her office to continue the conversation, And I went there with this exact slide to show her, hey, you know, I'm a DEI advocate, I'm a disability advocate. This really impacted me. Please, next time, you know, if someone like me comes to you, this is not to blame you or anything, but please be considerate of how the impact this can have on someone. Why did that woman end up calling security on me for advocating for my disability rights and actually trying to educate her to do better for other people? She called security on me, and I remember having to call my partner as I was being brought down the lift to that building, and ultimately crashed and had a panic attack because it was so debilitating. And I remember one of the thoughts that I had was, oh my days, like if I didn't have the support system I have today, and if I didn't have the knowledge that I have today about my brain, I would not feel like being around on this planet. So it's very important that we show different realities of what autism can look like, or any neurodivergent condition can look like in different people with different factors of identity, so that people like me can also be recognized by practitioners and public servants, teachers, and whatnot. In their book, Unmasking Autism, Dr. Devin Price highlights the pervasiveness of stereotypical constructs of autism that invisibilize people who are not white men from being perceived, diagnosed, and supported as autistic. They give the examples of Dustin Hoffman from Rain Man as this distant and genius savant and helpless person, and then Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang Theory, who is this like nerdy and condescending know-it-all. Or we can think as well of Sean Murphy in The Good Doctor, who is this hyper competent but yet cold practitioner. Dr. Devin Price emphasized that despite being on the whole spectrum of traits, there's little room for autistic people who are sensitive, emotionally expressive, artistic, and uninterested in academic success. So they give, alternative representation of autism in media, such as Queen's Gambit Beth Herman, this beautiful substance-addicted chess player, and it's heavily implied that she's autistic. Or they speak as well of Abed Nadir from Community, who is this Palestinian Muslim man, as well as the more cliched, chilly demeanors and difficulty smiling. So you can imagine how, through using the lens of ASD representation of autism in media, we are further adding to the problem of the misdiagnosis and underdiagnosis crisis we're globally facing, right? I think one of the statistics I read recently was that it is suspected that 75% of people who are ADHD are currently undiagnosed, 75%. So how many lives are we failing out there? And what would have happened to my will to live if I had not been diagnosed last year and kept feeling like the failure and oddity the world made me feel like I was, right? And it's very important to go further than our own reality. So I spoke about race and gender, but when you look at, for instance, the double rainbow between autism and queerness, right? There's research that proves that there's a higher propensity within the queer communities to be autistic. And one of the suspected reasons for this is that we're nonconformists. So we're more likely to do things differently than what society expects the norm. So we need to talk about these things as well. And more importantly, when you think of Judy Singer, who coined the term neurodiversity, and how she harmed the trans community with her transphobic comments last summer. For this, she was held accountable by many people in the neurodivergent community for being in misalignment with the efforts she was trying to do to conduct or to push forward with neurodiversity advocacy. You cannot be a neurodiversity advocate and be transphobic when you see these statistics. We need to really rethink of neurodiversity intersectionally. This is a comic that I love to share, and which made me smile. It made me feel seen. And the reason for this is that oftentimes when you look at how repetitive behaviors, or so-called stimming in autistic people, the listing of how this can look like in medical documentations often look at how it's presented in boys, right? White boys. So how can Black people recognize that drumming on a table or playing with their acrylic nails, twerking, playing with their braids might also be forms of repetitive behaviors or steaming. And how can we bring this cultural knowledge to practitioners, to society, so that more and more people can be supported effectively? So I got my 2 diagnoses. My official diagnosis, I got it, I think, a week before that incident with the public servant for autism. And in February 2022, if I'm not mistaken, I got the ADHD diagnosis. Since then, my life has completely changed. I have realized that, you know, I've always been an entrepreneur. I've always been a disruptor. I've always been an advocate. And I understand how my being autistic or being ADHD precisely shaped these great strengths that I have. And that helped me also kind of give less importance to how society views me, no matter how it still impacts me today. And I've shown you how in recent months, this has been the case for me still. So for me, my neurodivergence late diagnosis has been absolutely life-changing. I have been given the keys to my own brain at nearly 30 years old. 30 years old. So please, as I wrap up, I really want you to understand and remember that when you're trying to help neurodivergent people, think of them intersectionally, right? If you're a woman trying to help neurodivergent women out there and you're white, think of Black women who are neurodivergent. Think of younger women who are neurodivergent. Think of women from different social classes. And if you are a neurodivergent person who's physically abled, think of those who don't have, who are not physically abled, and so on, right? And finally, I want to leave you with this important call for action. Inclusion starts with I. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Axelle. I really like the term neurospicy. I don't think I'd heard that before. We're now going to move to the question portion. We have about 30 minutes, I believe. The questions will be posed to each of the panelists, and if they may, please answer them in the order of Mary, Axelle, and then Hari. Since this is a inclusive language webinar, we're going to start with a question about language. All 3 of you have addressed your opinions of person first versus identity first language, and we are now familiar with the pitfalls of propagating deficit and disorder phrasing, as Hari demonstrated, the potential limits that focusing on labels places on developing more meaningful solutions. And Axelle has highlighted the critical deficits of applying single labels to such a large spectrum of people and conditions. So if you could please each relate any experiences or suggestions you might have for making those terms more inclusive, especially regarding intellectual disability and ADHD, and similarly, your opinion on the Diagnostic Statistical Manual definition of neurodevelopmental disorder, which I believe is the new category under which this spectrum falls. So we'll start with Mary, if you will, please. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the most important thing really is to move away from disorder framing and just use autism. You know, autism covers everything that we need. And yet it completely transforms our the way we frame it. So I think the only time to really use the definition in the diagnostic manuals is when specifically referring to the diagnostic manuals. But even as we've seen how, you know, it's been done in the Pelicano paper, even that you can avoid the disorder, you know, disorder framing. So just use autism. You know, I would never use the term ASD, for example. I would always just use autism. It's a bit more tricky, I think, when it comes to ADHD, because it doesn't fit as neatly into that, you know, that sort of identity first. But neurodivergence just covers that as well. And again, important to remember, you know, Tourette's, for example, and, you know, dyspraxia, dyslexia, you know, other labels that might come under that, multiply neurodivergent. And I think the key point really is that most of us are multiply neurodivergent. Neurodivergent conditions or labels don't come in isolation. Co-occurrence is the norm rather than the exception. And that's why I think the neurodivergent framing can be really helpful.
Thank you. Axelle?
Yes, I would add to that, because what Mary is also describing is the idea that many of us are multiply neurodivergent. So that means that we have multiple conditions at once. And there's increasing research looking at, for instance, the overlap between ADHD and autism. Some researchers even advancing that they might be on the same spectrum, actually. And when it comes to ADHD, I think one of the things that I read was that the term in itself is not truly explaining what the condition really is. So I think language is always evolving. The way we speak today is not the way we spoke 50 years ago, 100 years ago, or 200 years ago. So I know that humans are not the best when it comes to change. It's in our nature, but we have to sometimes look back to realize that language has changed before, and it shouldn't be a reason. Or rather, like, we have no excuse to consider the change of language to be more inclusive of people, to be more inclusive in the way we represent people's experiences, no matter the condition. I tend to use the word condition a lot than disorder. Of course, some conditions will be a lot more, let's say, disabling or impairing than others, but they still remain human beings.
Thank you. And Hari?
Language choices manifests in several key ways. One is inclusivity and accessibility. Language that is clear, direct, and jargon-free is more accessible to a wider audience, which means a wider spectrum of autistics can engage more fully with scientific content, whether they are authors, reviewers, or readers. Two is bias and stigma. And we've been talking about this all through this binder. Three is representation. Who is getting left out and who is getting included? Are we including only the easily researchable autistics in research? Usually the IT and DD population is left out of the conversation. 4 is authorship and collaboration. Autistics may face barriers in scientific publishing due to implicit biases in what is considered rigorous or appropriate academic language. This can discourage participation or lead to underrepresentation in authorship and peer review processes. 5 is ethical considerations. Engaging the autistic community ensures that scientific discourse does not inadvertently marginalize or misrepresent groups. 6 is policy and guidelines. Journals and publishers can influence language norms through their style guides and editorial policies. By adopting guidelines that favor inclusive and respectful language, publishers can lead the shift towards more equitable representation in scientific literature.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hari. Our next question will be asked by my Lancet colleague, Dr. Amy Slowgrove, who has not yet appeared on the webinar, but has been diligently working in the background.
Thanks so much, Matt. And a huge thank you to all our speakers and to the audience for really, just sending in such rich questions. We haven't got a lot of time left, so I'm going to consolidate some of those questions and not ask them individually. But I think considering who our audience is, to all three of our panelists, any thoughts on the specific roles of editors, publishers, journalists, as well in fostering neuro-inclusivity in society at large? And then if anybody wants to sort of add on to that, perhaps the importance within scientific publishing and research of the role of autistic people as researchers themselves, and not just being participants providing lived experience, but autistic people actually designing and implementing the research. So I think we will start again with Mary, and then to Axelle and Hari to finish us off. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I think there's an enormous role to be played by editors and journals and reviewers, because we have been so used to using dehumanizing language and you know, whether that's person first language or whether that's the deficit framing, it is what we have come to expect in scientific writing about autism and, you know, other forms of neurodivergence. And the difficulty is that as autistic researchers and autistic authors, we submit our work using neuro-inclusive language. And so often, the work that we've done in Autistic Doctors International, it has come back to us with a request to change all of our neuro-inclusive language, which we have kicked back against and we have refused. And we have, you know, we have to the point where we have, you know, plan to withdraw papers if, you know, if that hadn't been accepted, because it is so important that we don't perpetuate that you know, that stigma. But it has been quite a battle with multiple journals. So I think, and again, there is, to the best of my knowledge, is a group of autistic scholars working on some guidelines for the editorial process for journals. But again, there's the issue of epistemic injustice. We come up against this issue, you know, you're autistic, what would you know? How, you know, we're not seen as credible sources of you know, of knowledge or opinion on this. So what we need is we need allies from the publishing community, from, you know, the neurotypical community, who are genuine allies to the neurodivergent community, leading the way. Because again, it's just that epistemic injustice. So I think when reputable journals make that switch in terms of their policies, their publication policies, it has an enormously disproportionately beneficial effect, because other journals will then follow. And in terms of your second question, just briefly to say about autistic people in research, and again, it's all linked, it's all this spiral. The dehumanizing and stigmatizing language perpetuates that stigma, which means that people can't disclose. So the vast majority of autistic clinicians and autistic researchers that I know even personally don't disclose. So there's a difficulty even in terms of research, where people are autistic and involved in research but can't be seen as such, and then autistic people only being participants and not leading the research that ends up, as we know, with research that's not meaningful to the autistic community. So I think language is the key to changing this. It's the key to reducing stigma, so it's easier for people to disclose, and then we will have autistic people openly leading research that is genuinely beneficial to the entire autistic community. So I think language is really the key.
Axelle, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, of course. I think it was the Lancet that published a series on anti-racism about 1 or 2 years ago. And one of the sentences that stuck with me since then is how racism kills, discrimination kills, xenophobia kills. And I think this applies also to neurodivergence and the experiences of people who are neurodivergent. And I think of the statistics of people who are ADHD. If I had not been diagnosed with ADHD, my life expectancy would have been 13 years less because of the causes of, I'd say, the consequences of my traits in people driving, people taking care of themselves, people making careless mistakes, things like that. I think of kids who are autistic and who are 27 times more likely, I think, to commit suicide. I think 66% of autistic people, autistic adults to be specific, have considered suicide. I think women are 13 times more likely to, autistic women, 13 times more likely than their peers to commit suicide. So this is a matter of public health, right? Not becoming neuro-inclusive, not being neuro-affirmative is not caring about public health. We need allies, we need people as well to step up, but as Mary just explained, it's not safe for everyone to do so. I remember going on the Dutch Health Ministry public website to check the list of what I consider or what's considered neurodivergent conditions on our website, and many of these conditions are still referred to as disorders or illnesses and sicknesses. Like, how do you want then that this doesn't have ripple effect in how people are treated in employment, in schools and whatnot? So I think editors and scientific publishing have a major role as allies to play to save more lives and empower the lives of people like me, Harry, and Mary.
Thank you, Axelle. And Harry, thoughts from you?
I'll start with part about autistics leading research. I think rather than talking about one autistic or neurotypical being the leader, which seems to imply a position of dominance by one group, we should be thinking more in terms of what Judy Heumann used to term as collaboration, cooperation. Both disabled researchers and non-disabled researchers need to work together for meaningful change to happen. And most research is a team effort anyway. What the non-disabled researchers bring to the table is a lot of experience in how to go about research, and they've had a couple of centuries of head start in this. When you combine this with collaboration and leadership of autistic researchers, you get the following added benefits. One is autistic insights through a nuanced understanding of autistic experiences that cannot be fully captured by observation or second-hand accounts. Two is innovative approaches through distinct cognitive and perceptual experiences. This can lead to innovative research methods and findings that might be overlooked by non-autistic researchers. Three is increased relevance and application towards practical and relevant issues. Four is empowerment and representation as autistics in leadership, challenges traditional narratives of them only being research subjects. 5 is reducing bias in data interpretation from a neurotypical lens. 6 is building trust among autistic participants that this research is likely to be ethical and beneficial. 7 is policy and practice impact, as autistic researchers are more likely to advocate for changes that directly improve the lives of autistics. Their leadership in research can influence policy, educational practices, and therapeutic approaches in ways that are more aligned with the needs of the autistic community. In terms of your second question on role of journalists and editors, the first is responsible reporting. I don't much like articles that come up occasionally to try to stir up controversies or conspiracy theories. It's such a total waste of their time, because the eye on the ball should move forwards towards progress and solutions for all. A second is understanding the heterogeneity of autism and what evidence-based translates to. Like blindly reporting that something is evidence-based for autism is not helpful, because practitioners and educators literally take that at face value and do a blanket application for all of autism. In reality, evidence-based only applies to a small profile, and I discussed this in my recent Time magazine article, and so evidence-based findings have to be taken with spoonfuls of salt for the rest of autism. So if evidence-based does not work for an autistic, it's not the fault of the autistic for not progressing, it's a failure of research that has not found solutions for them. Because the consequence for the autistic who does not improve with this evidence-based stuff is extreme. They are basically written off and kept in special programs and group homes. And then we complain that this group is eating up resources and asking for attention. Media should also be calling out the utter lack of action. An example is that GI issues were being discussed when I was diagnosed 2.5 decades ago. Earlier this year, there was an article which made it seem linking GI and autism was a brand new discovery. The sad part is that because there has been no movement in finding explanations and solutions on this front for 2.5 decades, it looks like it's a brand new issue when it's not. A fourth is including a call to action. One magazine told me that I should not be including a call to action, which kind of seemed counterintuitive, because then these disability stories primarily become objects of pity and sympathy or inspiration porn. While this may increase readership, they don't do anything to help us. We want the story to generate action, because action is the actual impact.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Harry. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Axelle. Unfortunately, I think we're already over time, but we've all been enriched by your presentations and your responses to these questions. And I'm going to hand over to Sri to close us off. Thank you.
Well, thank you again very much to Mary, Harry, and Axelle for taking the time to join us today, and for your passion, for your commitment, and the very important and interesting perspectives and discussions today. It is clear that there is much more for us to educate ourselves on, and there is much, much more to do for us individually, but also within our professional roles. So thank you again. Today's session will be available for streaming and sharing, and there will be links to the prior Inclusive Language Series panels for those of you who are interested. I would be remiss to not again thank my fellow moderators, Matt and Amy. And in the spirit of all the work and all the effort and all the passion that has gone into building this Inclusive Language Series, very quickly, I would like to thank the working group, Isabel Goldman, Rachel Tucker, Madeline Myers, Zoe Mullen, Amber Miller, Kate McIntosh, Shankar Iyer, Philip Krusmensky, Flavia Heraldez, Gomez Perez Nieves, Bianca Brandon, and also Carly Britton, Sarah Rodiger, Lauren Manges, Abby Sonnenfeld, and Rachel Guest, just to make this happen. So wherever you are, wishing you a great day, evening, or night. Let's keep talking, let's keep thinking, and please do look out for more in the series of the 50th anniversary. So thank you again very much. Have a lovely day.